It's 1813, and Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of the French, has been embroiled in conflict with the Sixth Coalition for a grueling 14 months. His actions during the French Revolution and his awe-inspiring conquest of Europe was probably the most unforeseen and sudden rise to power in human history. Since becoming emperor in 1804, Napoleon, despite being in almost non-stop conflict, remained almost entirely undefeated. All of this started to change, however, in 1812, when Napoleon made the critical mistake of invading Russia after the Tsar, Alexander I, flouted the rules of Napoleon's continental system, trading with Britain in secrecy behind its back. Napoleon set out with his grand army of over 500,000 men, the largest army ever assembled at that point. Of the 600,000 men that embarked on the invasion, barely 100,000 returned. Most had died from the harsh conditions of the Russian winter. Far fewer were actually killed in battle. Things did not improve for the Emperor of the French in 1813. In March of that year, scenting blood, those who opposed the Emperor formed the Sixth Coalition and attempted to move in for the kill. The coalition was formed by Austria, Prussia, the United Kingdom, Portugal, Sweden, Spain, as well as a handful of German states that defected from the control of their French overlords. Napoleon's Grand Army was decimated by his invasion of Russia, and his new army was no longer the finely tuned instrument that it was prior to its Russian calamity. It was now largely formed of young conscripts, summoned by Napoleon to serve the state on his return to France, and most had little to no experience of real combat. While Napoleon was initially able to hold off the Russians, Prussians, and Austrians, he was eventually defeated at the Battle of Leipzig, otherwise known as the Battle of the Nations, in October 1813. While it was not a decisive defeat, the emperor knew that his army had done all it could, and he conducted an orderly withdrawal back to France. Following this critical defeat at the Battle of the Nations, the coalition had reconquered most of Germany up to the borders of the Rhine River, but they had not decided on what to do next. The Allied leaders met in Frankfurt and deliberated on the next course of action. The result of these meetings were the Frankfurt Proposals. The proposals suggested that Napoleon would remain Emperor of France, but he would have to forsake all of his claims to any territory outside of France. France would have to return to her so-called natural borders. These natural borders were the Pyrenees Mountains, the Alps, and the River Rhine. Napoleon would lose all of his conquered territories in Germany, Poland, Spain, and most of Italy and the Netherlands. And Napoleon, a man with more ego, confidence, and ambition than most of us can even dream of, found these terms unacceptable. In his own mind, Napoleon still had a strong chance at victory, and he saw the Battle of the Nations as more of a stalemate than a defeat. And it's certainly worth noting that in the subsequent invasion of mainland France, Napoleon was not defeated, but the war was lost due to the surrender of one of his insubordinate marshals in Paris, mere hours before the emperor arrived with his new army. In our timeline, Napoleon kept fighting, and the terms of the Allied peace offers expired because the emperor never replied. What if Napoleon understood that he had reached his limits? What if he realized he had not only exhausted France, its population, resources, and manpower, but that he still had a pretty good position and so much more to lose? What if he decided to accept the Frankfurt Proposals and consolidate his holdings, focus on the rejuvenation of France and its people, population, manpower, resources, infrastructure, economy, while preparing for future conflicts? That is the question of this alternate history. As we started in 1813, we have over 200 years of alternate history to examine. So far, I've laid the groundwork, but we don't have time for all of that in a single video. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there were 50 years of relative peace and stability. I believe this would still occur should Napoleon change his strategy. The remainder of this video will focus on the long peace and continue until roughly 1860. It will discuss how Napoleon would make the most of this peace, and how France would continue to progress under the Emperor's ongoing leadership, economically, politically, industrially, technologically, and militarily. While a British negotiator was present at the Frankfurt peace talks, he had misunderstood the stance of the British government, who did not agree with the conditions of the peace talks. However, if Napoleon had quickly leapt at the opportunity and accepted the terms, while Britain may be furious, it would have been almost impossible for them to retaliate alone, without the support of the other great powers such as Austria, Russia, and Prussia. Therefore, it would have been unlikely that any advances would have been made by Britain against France without a significant change to the status quo. Britain's main grievance with the discussions is they did not want France to maintain control of Belgium for fear of them using it as a staging ground for an invasion of mainland Britain later on. In reality, since the crushing defeat of the French Navy at the Battle of Trafalgar, it's highly unlikely that France could have ever reconstructed their navy to the degree required to challenge the Royal Navy, and if France embarked an army alone, it would likely be sunk before it ever reached mainland Britain. And while Britain did want the French Empire to be dismantled, they still wanted France to provide a strong bulwark to deter Russian expansionism. Therefore, it's likely the status quo would have continued for quite some time, especially if Napoleon ceased any acts of additional belligerence and aggression, and focused entirely on France's internal development over European subjugation. So what would have changed? For a start, in our timeline, Napoleon died in 1821, barely at the age of 50. I'm almost certain this would not have happened had he remained Emperor of France, with access to better physicians, as well as likely not having fallen into severe depression, which hastened his decline. Other significant figures lived far longer, such as Archduke Charles of Austria, who survived until 75, Emperor Francis of Austria, 67, Sir Arthur Wellesley, otherwise known as the Duke of Wellington, 83, not to mention many of Napoleon's own marshals lived to a ripe old age and survived until the middle of the century. I will leave it at that and assume the emperor could survive for at least another decade or two. France would thrive under Napoleon's ongoing leadership. He was an excellent steward and administrator. Napoleon had already ordered the building of many roads, canals, bridges, and other forms of infrastructure in the mainland during his time as emperor. He also developed the infrastructure of Germany, Italy, and other occupied lands as well, while introducing huge societal reforms, which arguably gave way to the unification of both Germany and Italy in the future. In our timeline, despite spending only 300 days as the ruler of Elba, Napoleon ordered massive infrastructural projects to the island, such as building roads, draining entire marshes, and developing its natural resources, mining industry, and agriculture in less than a single year. France would now safely have the largest economy in mainland Europe. While in our timeline, they were roughly tied with Britain and Russia, Napoleon would continue with infrastructural projects in France, such as bridges, and focus on consolidating his holdings in Belgium and the Rhineland of Western Germany. In our timeline, Britain had a truly frightening economy and insane industrial potential, and France fell behind the other major powers. This would now not be the case. Belgium and the Rhineland were two massive industrial areas for steel and metalwork. Napoleon would begin improving the iron mining in Belgium and the Rhine regions, which had huge stores of natural metals that were not discovered during the Napoleonic Wars. Also, steel production in mainland France was inefficient and carried out by small businesses with small-scale furnaces. Napoleon would nationalise this vital industry and bring it up to speed with modern techniques and larger production sites. Great Britain exploded off of the back of the Napoleonic Wars, becoming the world's only true hegemonic superpower. In 1830, the UK was producing 681,000 tonnes of steel per year. France was in second place, but still only had 263,000 tonnes. However, 60% of German steel production was located in the Ruhr Valley, which is now safely in French hands. Combine that with Belgium, which had a significant steel output on its own, and France is now an industrial power in terms of raw resources. This would increase France's metal output by about 50%, giving it around 400,000 tonnes per year by 1830. Easily dwarfing any other country aside from Britain, and preventing it from falling behind the other powers in terms of industrial output, as it did in our timeline. By the mid-1820s, in terms of economy, France would be far better off. Since it did not outright lose the Napoleonic Wars, but rather they ended in a neutral peace, Prussia would have never had the ability to expand how quickly it did in our timeline. France would have maintained control of areas which Prussia would have otherwise taken. This would have made France the largest economy in Europe, with a GDP of £3.4 billion. Other powers such as the US, Italy, Prussia, and the UK would all lag behind, between £1.7 and £2.5 billion. However, in Britain's case, this number is not truly reflective due to the immense wealth of British India and their other colonies, which still had significant GDPs of their own. Also, by the mid-1820s, a critical invention would have been made, and that is the steam train. In our time, Napoleon died just before this discovery, but in this alternate reality, he would be alive and well. He would immediately realise the huge benefits of being able to mobilise massive numbers of troops from all over France and very quickly transport huge quantities of armaments and supplies over great distances. As a result, the emperor would immediately incorporate this new technology into his expanding infrastructure projects. I would go as far to say that rail travel was such a critical invention that it could have entirely prevented or delayed any short-term plans the emperor would have for war, as the technology was such a critical piece of essential infrastructure with so much potential. It took Britain about 20 years from the date of their first short train line to open a near-complete rail network spanning the entire country. We can see the state of Britain's rail network here, at the time of its completion. Within 20 years, Britain managed to construct roughly 1,140 miles of rail network, according to my maths, and I'm going to make the assumption Napoleon could order roughly 50% more rail network in the same time. This would be due to France's significantly higher population, more powerful local economy, and the top-down authoritarian form of governance which Britain did not have. In Napoleonic France, the emperor had divine and absolute power. To Napoleon, his administrators were simply civil servants whose role was to implement his will, without question. The emperor himself held all of the power, and all administrative and political decisions were made by him personally. Napoleon viewed his civil servants as disposable, and once a resource had been spent, it should be quickly discarded and replaced. Therefore, the emperor had absolute control and could get things done far more quickly. I will also make the assumption that Napoleon's rail network would look something like this and be finished by about 1850 at the latest. There is one thing that Napoleon was desperate for, and that is an heir. In our timeline, the emperor said goodbye to his wife and child in 1814. He would never see them again. Once he was defeated at the Battle of the Nations, they both fled to Austria to flee the wrath of the returning Bourbon monarchy in France. In this timeline, that would not be the case. They would remain in France with the emperor. Their lives would not be in danger from the old monarchy. Inadvertently, this would avoid the death of Napoleon II, Napoleon's only son and heir. In our time, he died at the age of 31 from tuberculosis. This would not happen in our story. The young Napoleon II was clearly extremely gifted, and he excelled at his early education. He learned to speak French, German, and Italian, and he had a clear passion for the military and military strategy and history, just like his father. Under Napoleon I, he would have been educated not only by the emperor himself in terms of politics, war, and diplomacy, but also some of the finest military and administrative marshals in the empire, such as Ney, who was not executed at this timeline, Berthier, and Davout. Napoleon II possessed a very similar natural intelligence to his father, and also a similar personality and interests as well. So on having his education specifically guided by Napoleon I, his son would be raised to become the splitting image of his father. While in our timeline he was exiled to Austria, and effectively a political prisoner in all but name, in France this would not be the case. He would be the emperor's crowning jewel and primary plan for the future of France. In our timeline, Napoleon III gained great popularity by claiming to be the heir to the Napoleonic bloodline and ended up crowning himself as emperor around the middle of the century. Napoleon II would have taken this popularity to an entirely new level as the true heir to Napoleon I, and even more importantly, he was younger and naturally far more capable than Napoleon III. Napoleon II would have been extremely popular in France. He would have married young and had his own children early on. Likely by the 1930s or 1935, this would make the most of the peaceful times and secure the family lineage for the future, which would also be something Napoleon I would approve of. In 1838, Napoleon I, Emperor of the French, would have sadly passed away. He managed to maintain his guiding hand over France for an extra 10 to 15 years. His son would now take over the reins as emperor at 27 years old. He would also be in his prime and have learned everything he possibly could from his father. He would have also been carefully observing other conflicts around the globe, such as the Russo-Persian War, and the wars Britain would have had with its many overseas colonies. There would be no revolution against the monarchy in 1830, like in our timeline. By the mid-1840s, France will have finished its rail network, connecting France with its newly integrated Belgium and German territories. In terms of industrial output, Britain was still leaps and bounds ahead of any other country on Earth, with around 2 million tons of metal production per year. The US followed with 800,000 tons and Prussia 600,000 tons. In our timeline, France would only be able to produce 450,000 tons. However, with her newly integrated resource-rich lands and a modern steam train network to transport materials freely throughout the country, as well as a superior state industrial base which is far more efficient, France would now be producing 1 to 1.25 million tons of metal per year. Economically, France would be in a similar strong position with a GDP of roughly £4.5 billion, ahead of Britain with £3.6 billion. Prussia would fall behind with £2.4 billion due to a large area of their most fertile lands now belonging to France. And we must remember Britain still had immense additional wealth from its vast overseas colonies. One final advantage France would have during the mid-19th century is a significantly larger population. Britain's population would be a mere 20 million, Prussia with perhaps 26 to 28 million. France would now have a population of roughly 42 million people by the late 1840s. France now had a stronger industrial potential, economy, population, a strong, competent leader. It would have every single advantage it could possibly have. And this would have made it far harder for the Prussians to push forward belligerently, like they did in our timeline, especially considering France would by far still have the largest military budget in the world, and that budget would be almost exclusively funding the finest army in the entire world. Britain could bully France with its powerful navy, but Prussia would have no such luck on land. Prussia still continued to expand into other German lands, though they were more careful about hostilities toward France, as it never fell after the Napoleonic Wars. In terms of military developments, Napoleon II would follow a tried and tested tactic and focus on his military using overwhelming artillery fire. There were several advancements in terms of artillery in the 1800s, and this meant they had far longer range than before, and would still rely on barrage fire as they were reasonably inaccurate. With the large quantities of metal it could produce, it could create immense stockpiles of ammunition. The second advance was that of repeating rifles. This would also be incorporated into the French army, which would be the primary focus of French forces, as the navy was mostly neglected and really maintained only to deter other naval invasions and to project power over its colonies. France would accept Britain's dominance over the seas and not take action that would cause Britain to turn hostile. The Crimean War of 1853 to 1856 would likely go very similarly to how it did in our timeline, only France would have a stronger army, a much better military doctrine, and would likely lead to far fewer casualties. The victory of the war would eliminate Russia as a potential naval threat, and this would likely lead to France spending even less money on its navy and focusing more on its army buildup. Austria had also been diminished by the peace talks after the Crimean War, though Prussia was still expanding territorially in the lead up to the 1860s. The 1860s to the 1870s would be the decades where Prussia plays its hand, similar to in our timeline, only with a far stronger French position. As such, the Prussians would end up focusing their belligerence against the Austrians, and that's a story for another day. I mainly make travel-related videos about living in rural Britain, and soon, rural Korea, or wherever I end up. As you can tell, I'm a big history buff, so I like to give at least a little bit of historical background information to all of my videos, even if it's just a vlog. Once again, remember to leave a like and subscribe if you would like to see a second part to this video focusing on the Prussian Wars and the unification of Germany, and I will see you guys in the next one.